Shall we begin?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome everybody to the Hadassah-Brandeis Institute lunchtime seminar, which we ordinarily would hold in our building at Brandeis, but we're now doing online. So this is our first virtual seminar, and I'm delighted to introduce myself. I'm Lisa Fishbane-Jaffe. I'm the director of the Hadassah-Brandeis Institute. We are an institute at Brandeis University that supports research at the intersection of Jewish studies and gender studies. And as part of our work, we have the privilege of hosting wonderful scholars and residents who come to spend a term with us working on innovative projects at the cutting edge of Jewish gender studies. And this term, we've had the pleasure of hosting Esther Brownsmith, who is a doctoral student here at Brandeis and is just finishing a PhD in Bible and Ancient Near East. Her work covers intersectionality, intertextuality, and interpretive techniques. She is completing a dissertation entitled Inconspicuous Consumption, Conceptual Metaphors of Women as Food in Deuteronomistic History. And when she leaves us, she is going to take up a prestigious fellowship in Norway at the Norwegian School of Theology and Norwegian Academy of Sciences and Letters, where she will be working on their project, books known only by title, exploring the gendered structures of the first millennium imagined library, and working on her own project called But She Said, Para-Biblical Expansions as Fan Fiction, which I think is a continuation of the work that she'll be talking to us about today. So before Esther begins, I just wanted to talk about the logistics. Esther will speak for about half an hour, is that? Yeah. And during that time, we will ask you to stay muted so we can hear Esther. And during that time, if you have questions that cross your mind, if you look at the bottom toolbar, there is a chat function. So if you click on that, you can share your questions and we can see that, and Esther can see that and take it up when she opens up for questions. We will also at the end have an opportunity for you to ask questions by raising your hand. And how do you do that? I'm not seeing it now.
I'm not sure, but they can just make a note in chat and say that they'd like to ask a question and we can call them in that order.
Lisa,
yeah.
You raised your hand by clicking on participants.
Yes.
And then at the bottom of that, it says raise hand.
Okay. And we will see that if you do that. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Esther Brownsmith. Take it away.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. And I wanted to start off just very briefly with a content warning, which is that this talk is going to be dealing with issues of rape and violence against women, and there are some somewhat graphic images, so just be warned that that's coming and take your own safety into consideration. And I do definitely invite questions, whether they're during the talk in the chat window or afterwards. So I'm going to be talking today about a biblical passage, Judges 19, and some of you may have read it in advance, but for those who haven't, I figured that I would go through it really quickly. And I'm going to be doing so using what's called the Brick Testament, which is a series of Lego illustrations of biblical passages. There aren't a whole lot of illustrations of this passage for reasons that will become pretty clear pretty quickly. So these Lego figurines will illustrate some of what's going on. So I'm going to share my screen. Trying to share my screen. Hold on one second. Okay, and so you should be seeing the first image of the Brick Testament. Is everyone seeing that? Can you nod? Okay, great. So this story takes place once upon a time in the period of the Judges. So this was a period before Israel had kings or queens. And once upon a time, there was a Levite who lived in the Ephraimite hill country in a remote area. And he got himself a concubine from Bethlehem. The word concubine I'm not in love with. It's a little bit orientalizing, but there isn't really a better word for it. Some people use secondary wife, but we'll talk about it later and why that term isn't quite right either. But for now, we'll call her a concubine. So one day, this concubine became angry with him and went home to her father's house in Bethlehem. So after 4 months had passed, her husband came after her to persuade her to come back. And she welcomed him into her father's house. For a few days and nights, they sat there, they ate, they drank, they feasted. The guy tried to leave, but the father encouraged him to stay. Please spend the night here, enjoy yourself. So then finally, after 5 days, he wanted to leave again. The father said, please stay and enjoy yourself, eat and drink. But that evening, even though it was late, he said, you know what? No, we're leaving. So they set off with the donkeys and with the concubine and with the servant, and they started heading back home. So as night grew near, they finally ended up settling in Gibeah, which is a Benjaminite city. So these are Benjaminites from the tribe of Benjamin who were living there. And they waited in the town square, but nobody took them in for the night. Finally, an old man came and said, here, I'll take care of you, I'll feed you, I'll give you, wash your feet. Just don't spend the night in the city square. So they came in and had another evening of feasting. But later that night, the men of the town came banging on the door and said, bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. So the old man protested, this is horrible, don't do this. Here, I've got a virgin daughter and I've got this guy's concubine. Why don't we send the two of them out to you and then they can take care of your needs. Abuse them and do to them whatever you wish. So finally, the Levite shoves the concubine out to the men and she spends the night with these men, raping her and abusing her all night long.
Well, just leave it and I'll get to it.
Okay.
Sorry?
Whoever's talking needs to mute themselves.
So finally dawn comes and the woman is lying there on the lintel of the door with one arm outstretched toward the door. And her husband comes out and says, get up, let's go. She doesn't respond. So he piles her on his donkey, takes her home, and cuts her into 12 pieces and sends one piece to each of the tribes of Israel so they can see what a horrible thing happened. And when they got the pieces, they were shocked and said, nothing like this has been seen or done until today. Take note, consider it, discuss it. And they get together for a big meeting to talk about this horrible thing that happened based on these body parts that they received. So that's, switching back to me. So that's the story that we're looking at here. It's a pretty horrific story, and we're going to get into some of what makes it horrific. But I was wondering if I could get a little bit of audience input, and thinking about the story you just heard, how would you finish this sentence? And you can write your answers in the chat room. The men in the story treat the concubine like blank. So think about how you might finish that sentence and type your answer in chat. The men in the story treat the concubine like blank. Chattel, that's good. Any other thoughts? Non-person, meat. Someone who knows what might be coming here. A symbol, oh, that's really good. What is she a symbol of? Lisa?
Oh, okay.
An animal, consumable. These are all really great answers. The symbol of the absence of rule of law. Yeah, that's good. So what I'm going to be doing in my talk today is I'm going to be focusing in on one of these specific answers. Oh, a woman, touche. and looking at the ways that they treat her as consumable, as meat, essentially. And we're going to be doing that using a couple of different frameworks from outside of biblical studies that I'm bringing in here. So one of them is the framework of comic book studies. We're going to be comparing it to a particular trope in comic books and using comic books to illustrate some of what's going on. And the other is Carol Adams' feminist vegetarian theory, where she looks at the connections between consumption of meat and consumption of women. So let's get started. Okay, and I start with this hint, which is that if you want to be able to see me talking while this is going, you can go into side-by-side mode, which is under the view options. And that way you can view me there along with the PowerPoint that's going on, however you want to configure it. So this is my talk, The Concubine in the Refrigerator, Objectifying Women in Comics and Scripture. So we're going to start out by looking at comic books, and specifically at a trope that some comic book readers might have heard of called women in refrigerators. So this trope, this trope involves men in the comic books, superheroes, who have the women who are close to them, their girlfriends, their wives, their daughters, have horrible things happen to them, all to further the male backstory. So we're going to see an example of that coming, but this trope is called women in refrigerators. And the reason it's called that is because of a specific comic book story that happened with the superhero Green Lantern. So this is one of the first images that we see of this Green Lantern and his girlfriend, Alex. As we can see, we already have a pretty distinct impression of Alex from the beginning. She's portrayed in a very seductive, sultry way. And within just 3 or 4 comic book issues of this scene, she would be killed, chopped up, and left in a refrigerator for her boyfriend to find so that he could then take his revenge on her. And we're going to see how that happened. Bringing into that, I'm going to use a framework that comes from a theorist named Carol Adams. So she came up with this book, Sexual Politics of Meat, a feminist vegetarian critical theory. On the left, you can see the cover of the book, and on the right, you can see the image that that cover comes from. It's an old-fashioned postcard that takes a woman and, chops her up as if she were different cuts of meat. And so this is the fundamental argument of Adams, that women and meat are treated in the same way, and that if we have a problem with how we treat one, then we need to have a problem with how we treat both. So in order to support this argument, Adams introduces a few different concepts, and we're going to look at those concepts. So the first of them is the idea of the absent referent. And this is how, when you say, I'm going to be having something for dinner, you don't say, I'm going to be having cow for dinner. You say, I'm going to be having a steak for dinner. I'm going to be having a hamburger for dinner. And these terms for something point to an absent referent. They move away from the cow itself, from the animal itself, and turn your focus onto its consumable, edible nature. And so it's the same sort of thing that happens when you do what I did exactly a minute ago, and say a woman is a daughter, a wife, a sister, a girlfriend, instead of calling her just a woman, a person in her own right. And that's exactly what we see going on in both the comic book and in Judges. So this is a scene from Kyle's revenge after his girlfriend has been killed. And he yells at this villain, "You took away the only thing that was important to me, you butcher." Now we'll come back to the butcher part, but in the meantime, you took away the only thing that was important to me. Not you killed an innocent woman, not you ended her life, but you took her away from a thing that belonged to him. And we see this happening in Judges 19 as well. So you may have noticed as we were going through the story that it actually uses different words to refer to the woman at its center. It starts off by calling her a pelegesh, or a concubine, which I'm going to argue a little later indicates her sexual availability. So that's kind of how we introduce her. But as soon as they go to her father's house, they start calling her a na'ara, a damsel or a girl. And this is part of a specific phrase. It keeps talking about the father of the damsel, the father of the girl did these things. And this is actually a reference. The only other place in the Bible where this phrase, the father of the damsel, appears is in Deuteronomy 22, which is a case of a wronged girl, when it's a legal code about what happens if a woman gets married and then is accused of not being a virgin when she was married. And so the father and the mother take out evidence and prove that she was in fact a virgin. And then the father of the girl receives recompense financially for this false accusation. So it's an instance of this wronged girl, just as the Pelegesh was wronged when she went to her father's house and the guy had to come back after her. But it's framing it again in the context of another male, that the father is ultimately the wronged one. The father is the one who receives the fine of silver. And so then when we move on in the story, we get to the city, Gibeah, and the Levite introduces himself and says, we have straw and feed for our donkeys and bread and wine for me and your handmaid. So he's using a new word for her, handmaid or maidservant, that we haven't seen in the story before. But again, this is a reference to her availability to someone else. So we see this same word in Genesis 30, when Rachel tells Jacob, here is my handmaid Bilhah. You can sleep with her and have children through her. So calling her your maidservant is a way of saying she's available to you. I'm transferring this absent referent to focus on you, the old man who we're giving her to. And then finally, after she's been sent out into the mob, after she comes back in the morning, we finally see her for the very first time called simply a woman. Toward morning, the woman came back and lay at the entrance of the man's house. And there was the woman, his concubine, lying there. And this is actually this beautiful, concise Hebrew phrase, vahine ha'isha pilagsho. Vahine is this Hebrew word that means kind of behold or look. It's a way of focalizing something, like zooming in on something with a camera. And so we zoom in on the next word, which is the woman. And then we realize, oh my goodness, this woman is his concubine. So it's this moment of transferring her referent away from being this body that's lying in front of the house back to his ownership of her, his possession of her. So these are the ways that we see her used, absent references used to refer to her. The other major tool that Adams introduces is her three-stage cycle of objectification, fragmentation, and consumption. So I'm going to read this quote in full because it's kind of important. A subject first is viewed or objectified through metaphor. Through fragmentation, the object is severed from its ontological meaning. Finally, consumed, it exists only through what it represents. The consumption of the referent reiterates its annihilation as a subject of importance in itself. So we're going to go to this first stage of objectification, which is basically taking a living being and making it into less than a living being, making it into a thing. And we see this happen in the comic book through the way that Alex is visually depicted. So in the panel on your left, you see what happens when Kyle is just discovering he has the Green Lantern power to make constructs of anything that he wants out of green light. And so Alex challenges him, hey, make a construct of something that you know well. And so he makes this construct of Alex, except that it's Alex wearing this very skimpy bathing suit and posing like a pinup model. And she's, of course, a little bit horrified at this. But what it does is it gives us a glimpse into Kyle's mind. It lets us see how he thinks of her. And how he thinks of her is as essentially a sex object. But he's not the only one. We also see it in the right-hand column, where we see a glimpse of the frame as the reader sees it. And again, Alex is standing in this very seductive pose, but here it's the reader who's joining in the objectification of her. So it's indicating that the text itself is encouraging us to view her in this objectified mien. And we see that happening linguistically within Judges 19. Since we don't have visual images, we have word images. So the first way it does that, right when it starts to introduce her, is through this word concubine. Now, concubine has a few different connotations in the Bible. Sometimes it does just distinguish between a secondary and a primary word. So these were the daughters of his primary wife. These were usually the sons of his primary wife. These were the sons of his concubine. However, that's not the case here because we don't have a primary wife. There's only one woman in the story. And so these other cases in the Bible, when it's not distinguishing between the two, are pretty invariably talking about the sexual availability of the woman. They're emphasizing, such as when David's son slept with David's concubines in order to show his taking over what was David's, or when Reuben slept with his father's concubine. Again, this word appears when there's sexual innuendo about the woman involved. The second thing is that we talked about the Levite being from the far end of Ephraim Hill Country, but really a more literal English translation would be the ass end of Ephraim Hill Country, because the actual Hebrew word here, Yachate Har Ephraim, is talking about the thighs of the Ephraim Hill Country. So again, it's this little bit of innuendo there. It's not a normal way to talk about the Hill Country at all, but it is a way that adds in this body part of innuendo of thighs. And finally, we have this question of what the concubine did when she left him. So the way that we translated it when I first went over the story was I said she got angry with him and left him. And that makes sense in the context of the story because he follows after her and it makes sense that she's the one who's upset at him. But in fact, the Hebrew word there, zana, everywhere else in the Bible, if a woman's doing zana, it means she's being sexually promiscuous. She's being a prostitute. And there is philological background for translating it as anger. There's an Akkadian word, zenu, that does mean anger. But because everywhere else in the Bible, zana means prostitution, it gives us again this hint that maybe she was at fault for this. Maybe she was the one who was going and prostituting herself. And so these three different factors, all within just the first two verses of the story, they combine and they give us the same innuendo that we saw with the visual images of Alex, where we're viewing her as a sexual object rather than as a full woman. The other thing that encourages this objectification is the reunion subplot, as I call it. So this is, you might have noticed that we spent a lot of time at the beginning of the story with the guy going to the father-in-law's house and winning back the concubine, having meal after meal with them. And it's kind of weird that the story lingers on that because we could have just as easily started with a Levite was traveling with a concubine and this bad thing happened to them. And I argue, again, based on Adams, that this is because one of the mythologies of rapist culture is that women not only ask for rape, they enjoy it. Advertisements tell us that animals like Charlie the tuna wish to be eaten. And the implication is that women and animals willingly participate in the process that renders them absent. So in other words, by taking him back, she is participating in her own objectification. She is agreeing to whatever comes up next. So with that, we move on to dismemberment, which is the second stage in these three stages. And this is when a whole person gets turned into parts of a person, into body parts. So we see that in the Green Lantern comic in a fairly literal sense. Kyle goes and discovers his girlfriend's body and it's dismembered and stuffed into a refrigerator, as we see here, still wearing her high-heeled shoes. But this isn't actually the only time that she is visually dismembered by the story. If you look over on the right hand of this next page, we see a glimpse of her looking in the knife, and we see just her, that she's grabbed for self-defense against the villain, and we see just her eyes, her face in fear. And so it's starting to dismember her already visually into these different parts. And this is something that we see in one of the other really famous examples of women in refrigerators, which is The Killing Joke. It's this famous comic book which took Batgirl, Barbara Jordan, the daughter of Commissioner Gordon, and had the Joker violently assault her and then take these nude photos of her in order to torture her father. So again, we see this same story of a woman is being tortured and undergoing horrible things for the sake of a man's suffering. But we also see how these visual snapshots of her essentially dismember her into different pieces, make her into less than a person and just into snapshots of pain and of sexuality. And we see this dismemberment happen in a very literal sense in the judge's story, of course. He chops her apart into pieces. But what's interesting to me is that this process of chopping her apart is actually a reversal of the process of disempowerment that he had earlier in the story. So at the end of the story, he enters his house, he takes the cleaver, he seizes his concubine, and he chops her up down to her bones. And these first three verbs all appeared early in the story. In the first few verses, this same verb, bo, she let him enter her father's house. So she was the one who was allowing him in back then. He takes the cleaver just as he took a wife, a concubine, who then left him. So at the beginning, he tried to take, but it was taken away from him. And finally, he seizes his concubine, and it's the same verbal root, chazak, that his father-in-law overpowers him. He seizes, it's the same, it doesn't really translate in English, but it's the same root in Hebrew. And again, it's early in the story, he was disempowered by going into the father's house, by not having his wife, by having to beg for her. But at the end here, in the process of dismembering her, he's giving agency back to himself. And finally, we turn to consumption, which is, I have a little badge here from Herbert Hoover's campaign, a chicken in every pot. And this is when we start to look at that originally living being as not a person or an object, not even pieces, but rather as what it produces, as the way that it satiates hunger in a chicken in every pot. And so we see this going on when Alex is killed by the villain. He strangles her, and then he says, "I'm hungry." And it's this wonderfully ambiguous phrase, because hunger, of course, is a very common metaphor for sexual hunger. And he's kind of straddling her, her legs are splayed out beneath him. And so there's this question of, is he talking about sexual hunger? Is he talking about culinary hunger? They're in the kitchen, as you can see by the edge of the kitchen sink beside him. Or is he talking about what I kind of refer to here as ontological hunger, which is to say, is he hungry for something else? Is he hungry for more power and control that he's taken away from her? And we see these different meanings of hunger really emphasized when earlier in the story, and the last time that Alex and Kyle see each other, she tells him in this middle panel, "You run along and I'll have a surprise waiting for you when you get back." And so in this case, as she's telling him this, it is pretty obviously a sexual innuendo. She'll have a sexual surprise for him when he returns. And so he goes off to save the day. But when he comes back, he finds a note on the table saying, "Surprise for you in the fridge." So as he understands this, it's twisting this notion of surprise from a sexual surprise into a culinary surprise. Oh, she's left dinner for him in the fridge. Of course, as we saw, what is actually left for him in the fridge is her body. And so we see the text, this word surprise, uniting the sexual access to her, the culinary access to a meal, and then this horrific digestion of her essentially as an object of horror for him. And so we see these meals as well in the story of the Levite. So we have essentially three meals that structure this story, starting from the beginning. So we start off with this first meal, which is the Levite and the concubine's father. He comes to her house and they eat together. The impact on the Levite is he gets out and overrides the father, but the impact on the concubine is that she's removed from the safety of the father's house. The second meal, they go to Gibeah and they eat dinner with this old man. Again, the Levite escapes the townspeople, he defends his integrity, but the concubine is removed from safety once again, and this time kicked out into the outdoors. And then in the final meal, which we didn't actually read today because it takes place in chapter 20 and we just didn't have time, but the Israelites assemble and the Levite tells them about what happens. He incites war just to defend his honor. And meanwhile, the concubine appears as part of his description of what happened, but then disappears from the narrative altogether. So in each of these, we see a case where men are eating and where the woman is essentially she's what's for dinner. She's what's being consumed in order to further the story in the narrative. And I want to pause here and say that the text signals this by using really culinary terminology. So in this final sequence, he took the knife, he seized his concubine, he chopped her up down to her bones. This ma'achelet, the knife that he uses, is a very rare word, but one of the only other places it appears is in this culinary context, talking about devouring the poor of the land metaphorically. He chops her up. Well, we see this same root, natach, in Ezekiel when we have a story of making a pot of stew. Put in it the chunks, all of the good chunks, the thigh and the shoulder, and fill it with choice bones. And we see bones as well. Now, bones are not a sacrificial thing. We don't see bones in stories of sacrifice. What we see them in as stories of cooking. They're a way of adding flavor to meat, to stew. So I finally want to look at these quotations talking about what do I mean when I say that she's metaphorically consumed. And the first one is from the guy who actually wrote this Green Lantern story arc that we read together. And he was criticized for it for pretty obvious reasons. And here's how he defended himself. He said, well, I created her with the intention of having her be murdered. I took a lot of care in building her as a character because I wanted her to be liked and her death to mean something. I wanted readers to be horrified and to empathize with Kyle's loss. And I wanted to illustrate how truly heinous Major Force was. So what he's saying is that her purpose, her reason for being in that story was so we could empathize with Kyle's loss and see how heinous Major Force was. So the reason for her being there, was to be consumed as part of this narrative of Kyle, the Green Lantern, and Major Force, the villain. And we see the same twisting and centering of the man in the speech that the Levite gives to the tribes when they all gather together. They've seen these horrible body parts and they want to know what's going on. He says, well, the lords of Gibeah rose up against me. They surrounded against me the house at night. Me they intended to kill, and my concubine they raped so that she died. So it's all about him. It's all about the offense that was caused to him by this horrible story. And what's going on with the concubine herself is just a part of that. It's just a part of what his horrible experience was. And so I'm closing with a quote by Carol Adams, which is that the process of viewing another as consumable, as something, is usually invisible to us. And I think that that's part of why this particular vantage point hasn't ever been taken before on this passage, Judges 19, because it's so familiar to us, because women are still in comic books and in advertisements and all over treated as if they're consumable food objects. And so because of that, this narrative, this underlying metaphor that's explaining the plot of the story is invisible to us. So as we move into questions, I'd love you to point out if there's anything that's been invisible to me that I haven't noticed. So with that, I will close that down and open it up to questions and comments. I would love to talk more about this. So if you have a question, just make a note in the chat and we'll unmute you.
Well, maybe I'll start off with a question.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this, very thought-provoking. And before this, I had never heard of fridging or the motif of a woman in the refrigerator. And this is sort of a long question. So I'm interested, there's an interesting parallel between the Levite story and his concubine being thrust out because he's surrounded by people who want to sexually assault him when he's being offered hospitality. Mm-hmm. It really resonates with the story of Lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sodom and Gomorrah, when again the men come and say, give us your guests, and instead he offers his daughters. And we have seen feminist reinterpretations of that story. I'm thinking of particularly Michal Lemberger has a beautiful book of Midrash called After Abel, in which she tells that story, but tells it from the perspective of the girl's mother. And it says that basically Sodom and Gomorrah is burned down because that was her reaction to her daughters being offered up in this way. I'm wondering if you can tell us about it, if there's a parallel in the world of comics to trying to see these kind of stories from women's perspectives. Like where did this the analysis that produced Women in the Refrigerator come from? Is it because women have become involved in writing cartoons or comics, interpreting them? Can you sort of walk us through that parallel?
So the person who put together what she called a database of women in refrigerators, it's actually a website that you can look up on your own online, is Gail Simone, and she actually is a comic book author. So it did come out through that. And one of the things that I view as kind of a happy ending or reinterpretation of one of the examples is we looked at Batgirl, who was brutally assaulted in order to give her father a backstory. And then originally that was designed to just be disposable. Like the author, there's this horrible story about how the author of the comic went to the heads at DC and said, hey, is it okay if I shoot her and basically make her paraplegic? And the response, if you'll forgive my very crude language, from the DC comic people was, quote, cripple the bitch. So they have this incredibly callous story that took Batgirl out of commission. But the good ending to that is that then later on, a couple of comic book writers decided to reinterpret her, and they made her into the superhero Oracle, who doesn't have use of her legs, but does use her computer network to continue to fight crime and to continue to be a superhero. So there are definitely people pushing back against this and taking these women and giving them their own stories. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of anything like that for Alex, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or if you want to, because it was a little bit of a long question. Did you have any further questions along that?
Just so, like, when did women's voices in comics sort of emerge as an alternate mode of interpretation?
I would say in the 90s and 2000s is when it started to come out, when it started to become less of a boys' club. I mean, certainly there were women making comics before that. Alison Bechdel is someone I'm thinking of who has been making comics for a while, but generally they were more indie comics rather than within like the big comic books that you might see at a comic book store.
Okay. I see we have some questions.
Yeah, I see you have several questions here. So I'll answer the first one because it's pretty quick, which is, do you think that the comic book tropes hail from the Bible story? I don't think so. The parallels are really strong, and so I've gotten this question before, but as far as I'm aware, the author of the comic book wasn't aware of the biblical story, or at least hasn't ever mentioned any sort of connection there. I have a private question from Molly Ann. Were you aware of Carol Adams' theory before, and how did this parallel come to you? And so the way that it came to me actually was I was thinking about, this originally started because I wanted to submit a paper for a conference that was looking at speculative fiction and biblical studies. And so I was thinking about, oh, what are ways that comic books intersect with biblical studies? Well, there's this trope of women in refrigerators, and it sure seems to be happening in the Bible too. So I wonder if I could explore that. And so then I just started to dig into this Judges 19 story and dig into feminist interpretations of it. And one of the places that I came across it was in Carol Adams' book. She actually does cite it as an example of dismemberment in a literal sense happening to women. So she makes this kind of offhand reference in her book, and I went and ran with that essentially and said, okay, how this is actually a theory that really seems to explain a lot, and brought it together in that way. I have a great question from Ellen. We've heard much about Jewish comic book authors. Do you think these stories have their roots in Torah? That's a really, really good question, and I'm not sure what my answer is, simply because I know there are some really good books out there about the Jewish roots of comic books, And I know that they do talk about things, general inspirations among the superheroes, but I think my answer to that is actually that we don't need to look that far back. That Carol Adams's book is just full of examples outside of the Torah and outside of comic books where these two things are equated, of illustrations like that image of the woman being cut apart into cow parts that we saw with the book cover earlier. She has just a catalog of hundreds of images like these. So I would say that, could they have been inspired by Torah? Possibly, but I don't think you need to look that far back, because these are stories and tropes that have continued all the way into the modern world in general. Yeah, any other questions?
Well, while we're waiting for another question, as I was reading the story again, I was struck by the fact that she leaves her husband or her master
Mm-hmm.
and runs away. So she demonstrates agency.
Yeah.
And it goes back to her father's house. And I wondered about the nature of the relationship. It seems a very violent relationship, certainly in the way we see it in the end. And I wondered if this was a relationship where there had been violence all along. The violence he commits against her at the end is sort of continuous with that. I wonder if you could talk at all about that theme as it comes up in this.
That's a really good question. And it does go back to this word, zana, this verb of what did she do in order to leave him? Was she angry at him? Was she prostituting herself? Or one kind of innovative theory that I've seen from some scholars is that in this case, the verb means that he was prostituting her. So he was leasing her out for sex, and that's why she left him. So it's possible to read in there a story of violence toward her. I would say it's ambiguous enough that we just don't know. However, that said, I think that the level of problems that there have to be in the relationship in the Hebrew Bible for a woman to leave her man have to be pretty immense. So you may remember from the excerpt from Deuteronomy that we read, this man who accuses his wife of not being a virgin and tries to make a big deal about it and is proved wrong. The final sentence of that is that he's not allowed to divorce her ever. And so this is not intended as a punishment to the woman. This is intended as a punishment to the man, essentially, as an economic boon to the woman, because it meant that he couldn't abandon her. He couldn't leave her economically destitute because he didn't like her. So this is not a way of getting out of a marriage that you don't like if you're a man, because women were so economically dependent upon men. And so because of this economic dependence, things must have been pretty darn bad in order for her to leave. Like, it's hard to imagine a woman leaving unless things were so horrible that living the rest of your life dependent on your parents or economically was the only alternative. But beyond that, it is kind of midrash where we can certainly speculate on it.
I mean, I sort of read the father asking him to stay another night and another night as a way of trying to protect her, trying to keep him.
Yeah, I definitely do read it that way too, of he's kind of trying to delay the inevitable. And this comes back to that chazak verb of how the father is trying to exert his authority over the husband, but ultimately the husband wins that showdown because he does get to leave with the concubine.
I see you got some more questions.
Yeah.
Can I talk? That's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to add that in the end of the story, when he gets her out of the house and give her to the public, and when he tries to wake her up, like, get up, we need to go, and then he understands that she's dead, like, not patient to her. He's awful to her.
Mhm.
And maybe it's not like he's not punching her. Maybe he's not violent in a physical way, but he is. He uses her, and when he can't use her anymore, then he just chopped her up and sent her everywhere.
Mhm.
And I don't know what was the real intention of that action, because suddenly he cares. I don't know. But if Lisa asked about the violence in their relationship, I'm not sure it's violence, but it's just he's using her. And
Yeah, thank you. Agree. There's actually, you said that he goes to her and he tells her to get up, and then he realizes that she's dead. The interesting thing here is that's what the Septuagint says, the Greek translation of it, but in the Hebrew translation, it actually doesn't say that she's dead then. And so some people have speculated that maybe she was even alive when he loaded her onto the donkey and chopped her apart himself, that he could even have been the one who actually killed her, which is kind of gruesome and horrible, but the text leaves that open. It doesn't actually tell you when she died. So I have a couple of questions in the window. One, Terry asks, did you come to this from a comic book background? I grew up in a wonderful Jewish family that had a love for comic books, conventions, etc. As a young girl in the 1970s, I always felt a little left out due to the roles of women, except for Wonder Woman. And yeah, I didn't really grow up with comics too much. I was definitely into geeky conventions, but more on the sci-fi fantasy side than on the comic book side. But in many ways, I was introduced to comics by women. The first person that I knew who was a huge comic book fan was a woman, and that was kind of my introduction to it. And so there is this tension there, I think. I think that you're absolutely right that comic books do objectify women in this way. And so they are definitely getting better, and there are some really wonderful female comics. Kelly Sue DeConnick, I love her stuff, and other authors, not just female, who have written more things in recent times, but it's definitely a still developing area, and it definitely is even now a male-dominant field. Dana asks, what was the difference between a concubine and a wife in terms of divorce? We don't know is the short answer. There aren't actually, in the legal laws of the Torah, it doesn't actually talk much about concubines. So we don't know whether they were different or whether they would have had similar rights in terms of divorce. Although one can speculate that the women's rights would not have been very strong. Molly Ann asks me privately, what was the message to the tribes supposed to be? So what's interesting here, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but this chopping a body into 12 parts and sending it every which way is actually, a lot of people think, an allusion to later in the Deuteronomistic history when Saul does this. He takes a cow and chops it into 12 parts, and he sends it to the 12 tribes as a warning. And so a lot of people read this story as a whole as having anti-Saul overtones. So Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. It's all about how Benjaminites are evil, and various other little clues through the text. So the chopping into 12 bits and sending them off may have been kind of a parody or an allusion to Saul doing that in order to warn people militarily. In this case, I think that within the story, its purpose is supposed to be to evoke horror and to bring people together in the wake of this shared evoked horror. It's a way to summon people by visually indicating that something is very, very wrong in Israel. I have Ellen asks, so what do you take away from the ambiguity of the concubine state on the doorway? Good question. So one thing that I didn't mention in my talk that I sometimes mention is that when we're talking about meat, we do talk about the original animal when we're talking about it in the context of a carcass, of when there's nothing left. So you take the meat off of a cow and you're left with a cow carcass. And so in the same way, we see her called a woman when at this point in the story, when she's left there on the doorstep and there's no further use for her. She's had everything else taken away from her. And so I would say the ambiguity about whether she's alive or not is, in a sense, saying that it doesn't really matter because she's already had everything important taken away from her. It doesn't really matter whether she's alive or not because she's less than an object now. She's already been taken away and abused. I have a private comment saying, sounds like a concubine is better than a slave, and that is true. Concubines were, I don't want to say they weren't slaves, but they were not the normal kind of slaves. I mean, there's this question of what does being a slave mean? Were wives slaves? And I don't want to get too far into that, but there was definitely a distinction legally between a slave and a concubine. Yeah, Renee comments, they were not for sale like a slave, for sure. Other questions or comments? You're welcome to speak up if you'd rather not type.
I'm going to speak. This is Ellen Umansky. I started to type, but this is faster than what I was going to say. I'm wondering, Esther, if you could give us some other examples from comic books in which women are objectified and in which women are killed and dismembered. And similarly with scripture, I think it's not very difficult to think of many instances in which women are objectified, but what about instances in which they're actually killed and dismembered?
Okay, that's a really great question. I will start with the scripture one because that's more of my field than comic books is kind of a secondary interest, but not my main academic focus. So my dissertation looks at a couple other instances. It looks at the rape of Tamar and it looks at the death of Jezebel. And in both of those instances, I do argue that this three-stage cycle of objectification, fragmentation, and consumption takes place with the women. That said, Tamar is obviously not literally killed and dismembered. And Jezebel is, in a sense, dismembered. Her body is eaten by dogs, but not quite in the same way. So I certainly couldn't argue that there is tons of dismemberment going on in the Bible because this is one of the only examples where it takes place in a very literal sense. But I would argue that these other stories about women being raped and women being killed do nonetheless have indicators of the same cycle going on where they're being objectified and divided into their fragmentary parts and so on.
Of course, one major way that women are objectified in the Bible is by not having a name.
Right, absolutely.
Right? Including the concubine in the Judges 19 story. Whereas in the Green Lantern example, I know nothing about Green Lantern, but she has a name and he loves her. I'm just wondering, you know, again, I don't know if you know about this through comics. I mean, there were many strong women characters in comics since the 1940s. Wonder Woman in the 40s, you have Supergirl in the 50s, Batgirl will eventually come into being. So that's why I'm really I'm trying to think of other comics, classical comics especially, you know, ones from the heyday of comic books, in which women are, I don't know, objectified maybe. I mean, I'm thinking, I mean, there are women who in comics appear as villains, but they're strong. I mean, women are strong in the comic books that I can think of. So I'm trying to see maybe somebody else knows examples of women as objectified and women as killed and dismembered, or women killed because they are women.
Yeah. So one thing is I would encourage you to check out that website, Women in Refrigerators. If you search for it, it's either the first or the second result. And it has a long list I actually pulled up on my computer and I'm looking at it, which is dozens and dozens of examples and mentions what happened to them. And I'm trying to think but I think that the Batgirl is really one of the other prime examples, the instance that I went into earlier where she has these horrible things happen to her, but it's not because, even though she was in her own right a superhero, but the context for the bad things happening to her is because the Joker wants to torture her father. And so you have, I think that that's the case with a lot of the examples on the women in refrigerators list, where there may have been points in comics in which they were fleshed out characters, superheroines, etc. But at some point as part of a story, they were used and objectified in this way and had horrible things happen to them. I'm seeing a whole bunch of examples being written in the chat, and the Phoenix Force Dark Phoenix story arc would be really interesting to analyze through this. I haven't kind of gone to that storyline with this in mind, but I think that's actually something that I'd like to do, because I do think that that's a really interesting connection. Yeah. I don't know if I've fully answered your question, but I would say that the reason that I started with these examples is because they are the easy ones. You know, they're the low-hanging fruit where it's clear what's happening. But I do think that there are many other examples where a similar process takes place in maybe a less literal form.
Well, thank you.
So I have Maura saying, yeah, this is like a case in India where a girl was raped for a whole night by several men about a decade ago, and just a short time ago, the men were executed. And then I have Tikva saying, I'm thinking of the communal nature of meat and the way in which the concubine was basically made public property in a way that made her the focus of public consumption. Neither entity has agency, both are discarded once consumed. Yeah, that's a really good point, the way that meat can be a communal thing. And one of the interesting things about meat is that it's seen as a manly thing to cook, that it has a lot of masculine associations with it. And you think about men being like the grill masters in barbecues and grilling. And so there is definitely a parallel there for sure. And then Linda says, what about Daisy May and Little Abner by Al Cap, which I'm afraid is before my time, but I will have to look into it. And Flash Gordon. So thank you. These are really good, and I'll definitely look up those examples as more instances.
I think we might have time for one more question, or maybe I'll make a last comment. I also work on African customary law, where bride price is paid in cows. And so women are actually equated with beef. So, and you know, a skilled, you know, woman with a PhD is worth many, many cows. Yeah. Anyway. I think do we have one more question? I can't see the private chat.
I don't. I have a couple of interesting comments that I might reply to afterwards, but I'm not. Well, Joan asks about the Archie comics series that included two teenage girls that seemed like they were on equal footing with their male friends. And yeah, I am in no way arguing that every single time that a woman appears in comics, she is necessarily being objectified. That said, my impression as someone who did not grow up with the Archie comics and is coming to them later is that there is some level of objectification of Veronica and Betty as kind of rival girlfriend types, and in the way that they're drawn as kind of stylized women, but I'm afraid I just don't know enough about the comics to really be able to comment on that too much.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think we've all enjoyed this as a really fascinating exegesis of a challenging biblical text and an introduction both to biblical interpretation and to comics for people from a range of disciplines. I want to thank everybody who came and joined us today. We had quite a big crowd. And to tell you that if you want to participate in more seminars, hear from HBI, follow us on Facebook and we'll be posting details there. And you can sign up for our mailing list on our website. And please join me again in thanking Esther for a really terrific talk.
Thank you.
I think we can all.
And we will be posting the recording of this online, right?
Yes.
Great.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. Take care.